First of all, let me thank you all very much for joining this webinar here today. Very happy to have you with us. My name is James Mulcairns. I'm the coordinator of the ISSD Africa Community of Practice. And I'm very happy that you'll join this webinar, which we're co-hosting with our partners in the Pro Wash and Scale initiative. And you can see here on the slide, today's webinar, the title is Rethinking Seed Aid Through Market-Based Approaches. Now, this webinar is in part based on a recently launched paper, and we'll be discussing that paper as the webinar progresses. That paper is, if you bear with me for the title, which I don't have here in front of me again, but in any case, we'll be discussing it as we proceed. Um, a little bit of housekeeping. I can see it already happening here in the chat. Please introduce yourself, your name, your organization, your country. Very happy to see where people are calling in from. And what we'd like to do is also just to understand a little bit how familiar everybody is with market-based approaches for seed security. So maybe if you're happy to give an indication whether these are new approaches for you, whether you have some moderate experience, or whether you consider yourself very experienced. And I would say don't be shy to do so. Again, only panelists will have microphone and camera abilities. We do encourage everybody to, as you're listening to the presentations, please share your questions, your comments, your reflections here in the chat. We may not get to address all of the different questions, but we quite commonly take some of the questions from the chat afterwards, and then when sharing the slide deck and the recording after the event, we can answer some of those really key questions then. So after I'm done giving us a short introduction, we'll hand over to Sasha, who's been the lead author and very experienced with the market-based programming framework for seed security. We'll hear about a case study from Nigeria from an agro representative. Then we'll hear from an FAO representative who I'll introduce in a moment. And we'll also hear about the challenges and the recommendations that were explored in developing the paper. And again, we'll come back to your questions in the chat and another couple of discussion questions for the panel towards the end of our hour. So for those of you who may not know, the ISSD Africa Community of Practice is currently looking to advance the HDP nexus for Africa seed sectors. Really, we're looking at three questions. It's really about how can emergency seed security interventions, how can humanitarian interventions be more effective, market-oriented, and really do no harm and be more sustainable. At the same time, as part of the HDP Nexus, we need to see that seed sector development approaches are better able to deal with the unique circumstances and dynamics that you find in conflict-affected and emergency contexts. And what is quite new for many or all of us working in seed sector development is to try and better understand and develop ways that our approaches, our interventions can contribute more deliberately to positive peak outcomes. And here you can see on the slide, would like to acknowledge our continued support from our donor, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and of course our implementation partners who play a key role in the community. Now, in particular for ISSD Africa, this webinar is really linked to the work of Action Learning Project 3, led by Mercy Corps, that's Seed Business Development in Fragile Contexts. ALP3, as we call it, looks at two really key questions, and it's about understanding what are the most effective interventions to build resilience and improve seed sector performance in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. And in doing so, what are the real incentives for private sector and what are the real business models that are effective and yeah, more sustainable and really resilience oriented. Now, as I mentioned, this webinar is held in partnership with the Pro Wash and Scale initiative. So, and Pro Wash and Scale are also, we developed the paper together. Now, Pro Wash and Scale is an initiative funded by USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance and currently managed now by the US Department of State. The program is implemented by Save the Children and Mercy Corps, and the initiative strengthens the design, implementation, and overall effectiveness of food and nutrition security programs with specific focus on agriculture, markets, water, and natural resource management, as well as WASH activities, and really focusing on emergency contexts. Short word about today's speakers. Momentarily, I'll hand over to Sasha Munch. Sasha has been the main author of the paper we're discussing here today. Sasha is a senior market systems expert, currently independent but with a long track record with Mercy Corps. Jeffrey Otim is a senior advisor, Seed Systems at Mercy Corps, and leads the Action Learning project within ISSD Africa. John Rajkara is a senior specialist, agriculture market systems at Agra, and we'll be talking about some of his experiences in the rural resilience activity in Nigeria during his time also with Mercy Corps. And Sean McGuire is an agricultural officer focusing on seed security at FAO. And Sean will be sharing his reflections on market-based approaches, but also sharing some insights specifically on Uganda, Mozambique, and Afghanistan. Okay, thank you very much. Sasha, I'd like to hand over to you. So I see you turning on your camera and microphone. You're very welcome, and please over to you for your remarks.
Thank you, James, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you are in the globe. So why are we talking about the subject today? Why is it important? As many of you know, humanitarian aid in general was designed in a different era when we thought of humanitarian responses normally as short-term responses to a specific shock. But we are mainly working now in places of protracted crisis with ongoing shocks and stresses caused both by humans and natural disasters. And so a humanitarian response may last for many years. And the traditional humanitarian approaches that we use, if they go on too long, can actually interfere with local coping mechanisms and the systems that the people we care about rely on to cope and adapt. They can create unintended consequences. So specifically for the seed security, they can drive the private sector away. They can benefit one group over another, creating inequalities, and they can make seed more expensive or even unavailable for people who are not receiving seed aid. And they can actually create dependency in the long term. And so there have been many efforts recently to reduce these unintended consequences and to make short-term aid more supportive of long-term resilience. Next slide, please. So one of those approaches is called to make short-term aid more resilient is the market-based programming framework, which was developed a few years ago by the Markets in Crisis Community of Practice using a large consultative process. And the Market-Based Programming Framework, or MBP, provides guidance on a range of market-based approaches in fragile contexts across multiple sectors. And if you look at the diagram, you start in the middle with immediate relief interventions, and you gradually move outward to longer term interventions. And what the framework says is at a minimum, short-term interventions should be aware of levels of market activity and should use markets to provide essential goods and services so that you're supporting markets, not undermining them. And as interventions move beyond life-saving needs, they should directly support market actors so that people can continue to rely on those local markets to cope and adapt. And then finally, as programs look at longer-term resilience, they should help local market systems adapt and become more accessible, inclusive, and competitive so that we can eventually reduce the need for long-term aid. Next slide, please. So what we've done in the paper that has been shared with you is taken the MBP framework that applies to multiple sectors and applied it specifically to seed security. And this aligns with the 10 principles for good seed aid, particularly the principle that humanitarian assistance should support, not undermine, critical market functions. And the paper has a very long list of seed interventions that fit the different levels of this, giving their strengths and limitations and some of the key questions to ask to decide where they're appropriate and how to implement. And what you'll see that we recognize that some of these interventions can fit different levels depending on the extent of the activity. So that's why if you look at the scales from level 1 to level 3, there's a gradual shift in colors. I am not going to explain all the interventions because that would take a very long time, but I'm just going to go through a few examples to give you a sense of the type of market-based interventions available and their level of market engagement. Next slide, please. So if you look at the bottom of this ladder diagram, the bottom is the most minimal market support activity. And that is, instead of importing seed and distributing it for free to farmers, contracting local seed suppliers to distribute it. So at least you're buying locally and you're supporting local sellers. Another example of the most basic using markets is to provide cash or vouchers to farmers so that they can buy seed from their preferred sellers. If you just provide cash, that is still considering just using a market. But if you engage more with those market sellers, if you directly support them to stay in business and continue to supply seed, that becomes a level 2 supporting markets. So that could include giving them financial support grants to buy seed or rehabilitate their shops. It could be making sure that they have access to seed supplies. It could be giving them information on the types of seeds desired by farmers. Another example of level 2 supporting markets which is to help key seed supply chain actors stay in business. Another example of this might be to help seed producers restart seed production. That direct support to markets starts to shift into market system change, level 3, if you actually are rebuilding or developing some of those market linkages. So from seed importers to wholesalers to retailers. One example of that might be developing local village agents to ensure that seeds are sold right down in the villages where farmers live and connecting those village agents to wholesalers for seed supplies and information. And then at the very top level, market systems change is programs that are working holistically on multiple aspects of both the supply and demand for seeds in both the short term and the long term. So that could include a very diverse range of activities, including supporting seed certifiers to certified seeds. It could be helping seed sellers develop demonstration plots so farmers can see new varieties, or developing sustainable supply chains. So that's been a very quick rundown of some of the examples that you can find in the paper. And we are now going to go through a real example that hopefully should make it more real. So back to you, James.
Sasha, thank you very much. Very interesting. Nice to get a clean, crisp overview that'll also hopefully trigger people to go and download the paper, which has been shared in the chat. Thanks very much. John, perhaps I can go to you to turn on your camera and microphone.
Yes, and thanks,
Great. Great to have
James.
you here, John. Now, you're going to talk us through a case that you worked on in Nigeria. So let me push the slide forward and then over
Yes,
to you.
wonderful. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody, wherever you are from. My name is John Rachkara, and I'll be sharing with you a case example of the rural resilience activity, a USAID-funded project in Northeast Nigeria that ran between 2019 up to early this year. The program was designed to support economic recovery and growth of vulnerable households in the Northeast, and these communities that have been affected by conflict. And early on in the program, we realized that perhaps to make our best guess, we needed to leverage on market forces and sustainable business models to make the things that we're doing stick. And after 5 years or so, we were able to positively impact about 900,000 people. We also contributed meaningfully to the economy of Northeast Nigeria. But throughout our implementation, we were very adaptive because the context kept shifting, but also new shocks kept recurring. So we had to continue adapting, with the situations as they came. Next slide, please. So I'll be sharing with you briefly now the three levels, or the three levels that Sasha has talked about. I think as the rural resilience activity, we were fortunate enough to apply all the three levels using the markets and up to also driving the changes in the market systems. At the first level, we again, many of us, probably everybody remembers that there was COVID, and USAID was generous enough to give us some cash that we actually use this unconditional cash transfers to move money to about 53,000 smallholder farmers. And many of them use these resources to either buy grains or also, stock seeds that help them to get back into production. We also use part of the funding to, move some resources to seed companies in order to help them stay afloat because, like you're aware, they had been negatively affected and many were actually going to collapse. And so this is actually how we were able to use markets on the first layer. The second level is where we were able to partner with 10 or so, smaller seed companies in order to help them scale up production in this very complex environment. And they partnered with almost 1,500, seed entrepreneurs, and these were growing and multiplying seed, certified seed, and serving the really hard to reach, communities that would traditionally not be within the radar or within the market catchment of formal seed companies. We also partnered with them to, drive farm awareness and set up demonstration plots for new varieties, climate adapted seeds, etc. And this really helped to, amplify, integrate so many farmers into, formal seed markets. In the third level, which was a lot more systemic, I think this is perhaps where we spent a lot of our investments, aware that we needed to make things stick. We launched, Nigeria Seed Information Management System that brings transparency and also brings new ways of trading. And by the time we exited, we had a significant number of users, both from the demand and supply onto the platform. We also did a lot in terms of improving the market intelligence, especially helping larger seed companies to expand into the Northeast, get to understand what's happening in the marketplace and how that would inform their investments. And I think a notable example, is one of the largest seed companies in Nigeria, decided that they were going to put up a large seed cleaning facility in one of the states, which was quite new. And it was a very positive impact as well for the economy, for the farmers, and for everybody there. We partnered also with some of the seed companies Sasha talked about village agents, and we had over 2,000 village agents linked and, formally integrated within the, distribution networks of seed companies that are now serving, even after the program has exited, they're constantly serving hundreds of thousands of smallholder farmers in Northeast Nigeria. And not also to mention, we partnered, with many of these seed companies that, from our data, we show there was a significant increase in the number of people who are using, a certified seed. It went up by almost 40%. And James, over to you. This is just a case example of what happened in Northeast Nigeria, taking into account all the three layers that Sasha has talked about. Thank you.
John, thanks so much for coming along and quite eloquently sharing your reflections and your experience in Northeast Nigeria. I will also say that you've triggered some points for reflection and some questions in the chat. So on the way up to the discussion later on, perhaps you can already take a look there, and we'll come back to those points when we get to that part of the webinar. John, thank you very much. Sean, I know you're there and I can see you turning on your camera and microphone. Thank you very much. Now, Sean, you're no stranger to the domain of market-based approaches, of course, at FAO. I'm very happy that you're able to come along and share your own reflections, not just on the paper, but what you're seeing in your portfolio of work. So please, over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I'm just going to give a few reflections, and I know colleagues will be coming in with more specific, discussing some issues in further depth. First reflection is really, I was not involved in this paper, so I'm happy to say, without bias, that I think it's really excellent and extremely timely, and urge people the links are in the chat, to read this paper and see some of the examples. And I think the analysis and this level of these different levels of involvement are really a helpful way of thinking about new ways of doing seed programming. But so back to James's question about reflections, one of which is that if we look at portfolio, and maybe more for FAO than other organizations, but I think quite a lot of organizations with seed security support, if they engage with markets at all, it still tends to be toward the level one, that using markets end. As we see in the diagram there to the right, that's just sort of trying to imply that the intensity of work is much more at that end. There's a little bit at supporting markets, and market system change is rather uncommon in my experience. Maybe we'll hear other people give, like John has, further examples where they have some more comprehensive engagement, and that would be fascinating to get more of that evidence from people in this discussion or in other discussions. So one reflection is really, well, why is engagement with market-based programming still very much at using markets end? And I'll just mention a few challenges. I know some of these are well known to this community around why direct seed distribution or different types of programming, these challenges around things such as seed quality, for example, will come to that. So these are not new challenges to raise. But one of them is, for example, around time constraints, that emergency responses tend to be very short term. Engaging with markets involves much more time, having to, building demand, engaging with research, strengthening market links. These are things that are best done over multiple seasons and building relationships. And emergency responses are often very quick or required funding coming in with very little time to prepare. So some of the challenges are also around moving away from, shall we say, more delivery focused approaches, whether it's direct seed distribution or perhaps better, using vouchers as a means to facilitate seed aid. There's not much time to do much more. Another one is in terms of skills gaps, that seed security practitioners often don't have a lot of deep knowledge of market systems. And especially if we start talking about informal seed markets, then that gap is general for many people in working in development in general, that there's a sense that, do we have the right people involved in formulating projects or in implementing them? And so the knowledge is not market systems development. That knowledge of that language isn't necessarily widespread. I mean, even the diagrams that Sasha was showing, which I found fascinating, until I'd read the paper, they were new to me as well. So there's a lot of scope for further exchange and cross-fertilization between market systems communities and the seed sector and seed security communities. Another challenge is immediate project goals, that project goals especially emergency ones or humanitarian ones, are really directed at seed security in the first instance and maybe food security. So access to seeds, people's ability to continue planting, production, and so forth. And other goals that are around seed sector development, strengthening the market systems, access to new varieties, maybe are not within project goals, let alone issues such as market resilience. Another issue is simply about partnerships. That do practitioners have the depth of engagement with market systems actors or with research and development or policymakers or other partners that may be needed to really have a deeper type of engagement with market-based programming. And finally, uncertainty. And this uncertainty is one, especially if we think of it in terms of emergency responses, where as larger scale ones, such as ones that FAO sometimes does, the overriding concern may be, can we obtain sufficient quantities of seed to meet our commitments in an emergency response? So then it becomes very much driven around supply, and those uncertainties make people more wary, perhaps, of engaging deeper with markets to say, well, we don't know if those markets will be able to supply what we need. And if we can't, even if we recognize the value of engaging with markets in that way. And I'm sure we'll talk more about some of the challenges in the latter part of this session. So I just briefly, as James said, to give some quick examples of market-based programming in FAO. And all of these ones that I've mentioned are long-term projects that have using vouchers in particular. So the first one in Uganda is actually a short-term project, I apologize, that was targeting refugee and host communities and using vouchers for facilitating access to seed, particularly vegetable seed. And I just mentioned this because this is an interesting case where I visited that project after it had finished and went and visited the recipient communities and the participating shops and saw that there were what I call positive spillovers, that this wasn't part of the project, but there was ongoing relationships between recipient communities and the shops in continued purchase of goods, continued extension activities. There were communities of women farmers that were conducting demonstration plots to explore new varieties or test them themselves that were provided from the shop for free as a way of generating further demand. So basically the shops were discovering new markets that they hadn't tapped before, and relationships were developing on their own because these two groups were introduced. That's extremely encouraging, and it does suggest that if a project were formulated differently with market systems development as a goal, or future projects that did, that those kinds of relationships could be leveraged even more and perhaps linked to other aspects of the market system. The second example, Mozambique. This is a long-term project over 10 years with major funding. And this was more of a comprehensive seed sector development. So it involved research and investigation of new crop varieties, a lot of demonstration plots and farmer field schools to test those in multiple locations, and then develop a system for delivery through market partnerships. So establishing new community-run seed enterprises, linking them to a network of retail shops, and then using vouchers and electronic vouchers using a tool called IDEA, which is identification, delivery, and empowerment application. I'll mention that a bit more in a second. And using those tools to help facilitate the links between farmers and shops with the information from trials of understanding which varieties were locally in demand and were discovered to be popular from demonstration plots, linking farmers to those shops so they could follow up immediately to purchase seed. And again, we see, like in Uganda, a case of these shops expanding their services, opening new outlets. These tools were used as a partial subsidy, But then in emergencies, that same system was used to provide emergency supply. And there could be some questions around that. Did that strengthen the markets or did it distract market system development? But at the very least, those systems were able to shift from development mode to emergency mode when a cyclone hit that part of Mozambique. The final example, Afghanistan, this is where we've been doing very, very large direct distribution of of wheat seed in an emergency mode for a number of years since 2021. And in Afghanistan, there are more than 100 private seed enterprises that produce high quality seed, but their markets up till now have entirely been institutional, whether the government and now the last 5 years for emergency aid. And we're now in the midst of a transition to try to help these seed suppliers develop markets. So to open outlets for retail, to do demonstration and other promotional activities with farmers, and to strengthen links back to research to bring in new varieties and keep innovation going. And so in the case of Afghanistan, it's a somewhat unusual context because we're starting market systems where they really didn't exist before, and using vouchers and other types of support to effectively create these markets together with our market partners, such as seed enterprises, to facilitate this transition from emergency toward development. And I'll close finally with just a few thoughts here on what may be supporting factors for more in-depth engagement beyond the first level of market-based programming. One is to really look more at the links between seed sector development and seed security and not treat those as two separate phases that are done. You do seed security in year one, and if things settle down, you do development a few years later, to really understand that. And the paper makes this very clear that even in emergency responses, they have implications for seed sector development. Secondly, engaging state institutions and market actors in a number of ways for innovation, regulation, and especially to scale up. Thirdly, where there are tools, and I mentioned IDEA before, that could provide information from multiple goals. An IDEA is useful for beneficiary management, but it also provided data to retail actors and to seed producers to give them more information to manage their markets better and to strategize better. So it was very useful for planning for us for reporting, but for market actors for their own planning. And finally, and I know we'll talk about this more, evidence of impact. So production or food security, those should always be impact indicators. But the challenge moving forward is how can we get good indicators for sustained service, for what will be important market functions? Who receives these services? And dare I say, what might be measures of resilience in the longer term? Thanks. Back to you.
Sean, great. Thanks a lot. You provided some real good insights there about the challenges that you've come across in the work, given some good examples of how FAO is tackling these challenges, and also some really good options forward that we can indeed discuss when we come to the question and answer. I do notice that while you were talking, one or two questions did pop up in the chat, so perhaps you might take a look there to see if there's something you were able to come back on. Again, thank you very much, Sean. So, Jeffrey, I see you turning on your camera and microphone already. Very good. Thanks. Thanks for being here, Jeffrey. Now, you've been heavily involved in the development of the paper and also in your role as the Africa Action Learning Project lead. So you're going to talk us through some of these key challenges, but also some of the recommendations that feature in the paper. So over to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, James. Yeah, thanks, Sean. You've just set us up well for the next part of this discussion, where we'll look at the challenges that kept coming across different contexts as we talk with practitioners. Just before I dive deeper into the challenges, I also want to emphasize that every market-based seed security interventions involves trade-off, and no approach is without challenges. And here on the slide, as you see, a full list of challenges captured in the paper. And they touch on a wide range of issues ranging from timing, transportation, logistics, to coordinations and information sharing, many of which will feel very familiar to anyone working with on MBP in fragile and conflict-affected settings. But for today, we'll concentrate on three challenges that came up most consistently in the research, with partners' consultations and the interviews. These are where we see real gaps and but also real opportunities for collective actions. The first one, as you see highlighted up there, is conducting integrated and context-appropriate assessment, and followed by the second challenge on seed quality and viability. The third one looks at inclusive private sector partnerships. As you heard from Sean, he clearly also hinted on some of these key issues. As I'm talking through each of these, we'll be asking for quick some reactions from you in the chat if this really resonate with your own experiences. Next. Yes, looking at the first challenges, focusing on integrated assessment, one of the strongest message we've had in that current assessment tools don't fully serve the needs of emergency or protracted crisis contexts. And seed assessment and market assessments are fully done separately and by different teams' expertise using different tools designed for development or routine market analysis. Humanitarian teams often don't have time or technical skills to conduct full assessment. When crises strike, everybody starts running around to provide support. So the result is a fragmented information, which in most cases ends up missing the signals on farmers' behavior and also limited understanding of how seed markets actually function under stress. And we heard repeatedly that there is a major gap. We still don't have a simple, rapid, or widely accepted tool that can adequately assess both seed and market system together. So in the chat, I want to see if you share some of these kind of experience. Share with us a yes or a no, so that we know that yes, we are having this resonate with you. And yeah, have faced this gap. Is there tools that works well? Yeah, drop it in the chat so that we can all get in touch with you next. Next, please. So next we look at seed quality. And of course, this is a major challenge all through, as most of us may be knowing. Seed quality remains one of the most persistent and difficult challenges in crisis. Affected markets. Humanitarian programs face pressure, as I said earlier, to act quickly whenever there is a crisis. And seed actors operate under uncertainty. And quality assurance in fragile settings is often weak or sometimes inconsistently applied. And donors and practitioners worry about the risk of distributing or subsidizing low-quality seed, while at the same time, farmers often prefer their local available varieties that may not go through the formal certification. And this creates already operational imbalance. And this combination has created a persistent imbalance that you see local actors are often sidelined, yet low quality seed continues to circulate in markets in crisis. So similarly, we would like to see whether this is something you've been grappling with. Have you found an approach that helps? Yeah, let us know in the chat by saying yes or no, and you drop us some contacts there. Next, please. So a lot of partners, a lot of seed aid still engages with private suppliers in a very transactional way. Just like also earlier speakers has mentioned about the private sector engagement. So you see short-term procurement, one-off tenders, or emergency distribution that bypass the long-term relationships farmers actually depend on. We just heard from Sean how it's important to connect the emergency seed security responses with some seed sector development. But across our interviews, we consistently heard that private companies actually want sustained connections with their customers and want clarity on demand so they can invest appropriately. And we know private companies should be the long-term sellers, like an exit strategy for any emergency seed response. They want to build this long-term market relationship, but this is not actually happening. So we also want to see whether this is something that resonates with you. What's one barrier you've seen to partnering effectively with private seed actors? Or if you've had success or just made it work? John shared some key examples from Northeast Nigeria. Yeah, thank you very much. These are some of the recommendations, and I will be happy to, some of the challenges, I'll be happy to interact more in the chat. Over to you, James.
Jeffrey, thanks a lot. I think people are listening to you and considering their response at the same time. In any case, thanks for sharing these insights from the various interviews and steps during the paper. We're going to move towards a discussion part. Now, I'm very happy to see lots of reflections and questions coming through in the chat. So what I'd like to do now is to request all of our panelists to turn on your microphones and cameras. Come back so we can all put you under the microscope, as it were. And I will stop sharing the slides momentarily. Now, like I mentioned, very happy to see lots of comments and questions in the chat. So I'm just going to ask whether there are any that you've come across that you would like to take on and answer, or that really triggered you. And maybe Sasha, I could ask you first, since you've been sort of sitting the longest. Did anything that you saw in the chat trigger you, or anything you'd like to address?
Yeah, there's been a lot of really great questions and comments in the chat, and clearly we could have a very robust discussion. One of the things that I've noticed is a lot of questions around how local to get. And I think this is one of those points of debate where markets people probably come at it from a different angle than seed people. And I will tell you flatly, I'm a markets person. And I have never been in a situation where I did not see private sector active. Even in the midst of conflict, there are traders moving key goods and services in for local populations to purchase. And so from the market's perspective, there are always market actors to work with. You can always support market actors. But in the most unstable context, you're probably going very local to traders that really know the local context and how to move things around. And you get into larger scale actors, more national level as things stabilize. And so from a markets perspective, we say find the local actors and work with them. I suspect some of the seed people may come back with the perspective that, well, we need to worry about quality seed and certified. And so how do we manage that? So we could probably have a big debate. We don't need to at this moment, but to answer the question on how local to go, and when you can support actors in what type of context, my feeling is there are always market actors to work with. If you have the commitment to do so, it's a matter of adapting and finding them and figuring out who's there. Over to others who may dispute that.
Thanks, Sasha. John, can I then pass to you? Did anything,
Yes,
would you like to add anything to what Sasha said, or did anything else jump out to you from the chat?
absolutely. I'll start with what Sasha said, our local. And for us, level two was like sitting really right at the heart of our local we got. You know, the 10 seed companies we talked about were those that were locally embedded into the communities. They knew the corners, they knew the hotspots, they knew, they were really vested into the community. So getting them to kind of like look for seed multipliers, seed entrepreneurs within the communities that they're working with. For us, that was why it became so possible. So they were our best bet, but we also knew that we needed, you know, bigger players who could really change the game. And so that's why actually when we were moving to level three, we needed to, crowd in other large players who were able to invest millions of naira into the seed market, and those were actually the things that helped to turn the wheels much, much quickly. Let me also say, maybe specifically to, the question that Eric had asked, how different between uh, market-based initiatives in, in just to get the question well, in the
How would your
context
two
that
and
I've
level
just,
2 and 3 interventions be different from a conflict to a more stable context?
yes, yes, yes. So maybe just to bring to perspective the context of Northeast Nigeria, there are two types of complexities. There are situations where people are concentrated in either a refugee camp or an IDP camp, a refugee camp like in Uganda. I think Sean has elaborated that. But then there are also situations where the complexity is so dynamic. People, part of the community, are actually in an IDP, and part of the community in their on location, but all of that dynamics generates a whole set of complexities that for us was something to learn from. But the beauty that we actually had was that we had a relatively long-term 5-year program, so we were able to put a long-term view of everything that we were doing, whether we were trying to solve an IDP problem in the community that we're working in, or we're trying to really alter how seed could be accessed in a complex situation like Northeast Nigeria. I know time is short, but let me pause here and maybe I'll come back with the other examples.
Thanks a lot, John. Very informative. Sean, basically the same to you. Is there anything that jumped out from the chat that you'd like to respond to?
Yes, but I'll pick just a couple. There's some really good questions there. First, a while ago from Gerard Steinhauer was asking what aspects of policy could support in transitions to levels 2 and 3. And this kind of builds upon what some other people are saying. I think Kristen Oplanik about informal seed systems and the comments that Sasha was saying around quality and quality assurance that, and it's a big question. I mean, one is the simple answer would be where policy is not restrictive, where these discussions, which are pretty cross-cutting on which types, which seed classes, whether it's regulated or unregulated seed, where is quality, what is allowed. So having policies that recognize that quality is important, but certified is not the only way of assuring quality. And for some crops, it may not be any way, it may not exist at all, certification. Or it may not be appropriate for some farmers to have certified crops because they're not in that market. Recognizing that crops are diverse and people are diverse. So having permissive policies, and I know that's very much the ethos of ISSD and others working in this realm. So that's the kind of short answer. Other things around policy, information, providing information, allowing linkages between formal and informal sectors, and then more general things that are around a strong seed system that provides innovation and lots of new varieties, and information allows for a richer system of both formal and hopefully informal markets to be able to circulate that material. That makes for a stronger system and more scope to engage with markets in a more sustained way. And very briefly, Machila Munyaradzi was asking in the context of when there's so much shift toward emergency response from longer term development in terms of funding, and emergency responses will continue happening in any case. What can we do to strengthen market responses? And on that, I direct them to look at the report itself, because it does talk about that. But just to highlight some of the points here is that even in emergency response, it's possible to work through markets using things like vouchers, working with market actors, even as a way of delivery is one way of keeping those systems going and keeping those relationships between farmers as clients and the people that serve them. Gathering evidence on those kinds of impacts are important. Links to research and development, longer term is good, and you can even do that in emergencies, as you can finding where there are gaps and doing simple things such as demonstration plots or testing new varieties that have been sitting on the shelf but haven't been demonstrated. And Catholic Relief Services and other groups have been doing this for years in Southern Africa with legumes within a fairly short-term emergency response, to have at least a little window to keep looking for new options. So it shouldn't be an either or, but again, I'll point to the paper that looks at a lot more ways of engaging. Using markets, even for emergency delivery, is better than not using them. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Sean. Jeffrey, then to come back to yourself. Now, you've had a couple of minutes to hear what your co-panelists are saying and also what's been coming in the chat. Is there anything you yourself would like to reflect on?
Yeah, quite a very interesting conversation in the chat. And already my colleagues have provided also a very great insight. I am compelled with one comment in the chat from Osman Sanogo. He mentioned just exactly the key challenge which the paper tried to put forward on the humanitarian actors don't have time to do assessment, whenever there is a crisis. And this is a very usual situation. So the question is, can we have a more context-specific tool that helps to understand the context before responding? And of course, he goes ahead and say that, yes, relying on certified seed alone may not be reliable. We've seen these cases also coming more frequently. So, and also saying that, yes, there are other options for seed sources that could be good for farmers, talking about quality declared seed, community-based seed multiplications, examples from Mali. This is quite a very interesting example that resonate with some of the key cases that we document in the paper. But of course, as I mentioned, this is a work in progress. This tool is not yet there. We don't have this quick tool. Of course, we have a very comprehensive seed system security assessment tool, and with a full e-learning platform that you can have so much information. But we've seen people come forward to seek for a quick, rapid, yet very useful assessment tool that combine seed security assessment and also the markets. So this is something which we put in our next scope of action, looking into the partners who we can work together to see that this specific integrated tool is possible to have. Yes, I think this is briefly what I want to share. Thank you very much, James.
Okay, thanks. And then a final call just to any of our panelists. We had a couple more questions, but we don't have time for them. We're coming up to the end of the hour. But is there any other final remarks based on any of the comments you've seen that you would like to quickly respond to before we close off?
I'll come in very quickly. There's so many great questions and thoughts. I would love to discuss all of these. There's been a lot of questions about, sort of in the current donor environment. And my pitch would be, I think working on more sustainable solutions is far more cost effective in the long run than continuing to do direct aid. And I think everyone on this call agrees with that. The challenge is we need the evidence, right, to produce donors, and it's to persuade donors. And it may be that it's about cost effectiveness over a few years rather than in the next 6 months. So I would pitch to everyone on this call to let's build the evidence. Let's use entities like ISSD Africa to produce that evidence and the pitches so that we can get donors to support more sustainable approaches.
Thank you very much,
also
Sasha.
will add a piece.
Go ahead, John.
Yes. Look, we all want to work with the private sector, to deliver some of these great solutions. And the temptation also sometimes is to, go after transactions or short-term deals rather than really facilitating strategic partnerships that deliver seed in this kind of context in the long term. And I think, we really need to pay attention to that, but also in instances where we are able to build capacities, build commitments from the private sector to look at, the various actors in the spaces that require services and products like seed as a long-term customer, I think that could also really resonate well, and not just to keep on the short-term transactional relationship, but rather build long-term commitment from the various actors as well. I think the willingness is there. We have seen that work very well in Northeast Nigeria, and I think it's also a call to action for actors here to put emphasis on that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, John. And indeed, thank you to all of our panelists for putting the effort in, for getting the slides ready, for being here, and also for these reflections and for engaging with the comments there in the chat. As we wrap up, I'm going to just hand back to you, Jeffrey. You mentioned a little bit about where you're headed next with this with ISSD Africa. Maybe you can give us a few more details just to close us off.
Yes, thank you, James. Yes, of course, I also want to emphasize that ISSD Africa see these challenges, and we are hoping to continue exploring next steps in coordination with many of you. In the next few months, we will be working with partners to build some more of ideas we touched today, exploring rapid joint seed and market assessment tools, and should look like promoting approaches that are simple enough for early emergency, but still useful for guiding decisions. And we'll also be raising more awareness in existing and around existing seed and market resources, providing training opportunities. So I really encourage you to stay tuned for our upcoming seed learning cohorts and our skill building clinics. Please let us know if your program team would like to dive deeper on any of these topics. And of course, on the seed quality assurance that many of us are very passionate about, we hope to surface more practical models that highlight examples of what is actually working in fragile contexts. There is a lot of room for strengthening quality system in ways that are realistic, but also responders and still support farmers' choice. So we are also digging into private sector engagement, as my colleagues mentioned, during crisis. Actually, not using private sector in crisis contexts could be a missed opportunity. So we'll be putting together a compendium of cases, of case studies capturing how private sector seed companies are operating in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. And finally, we want to help move, of course, the needle on information consolidation. And there's much great work happening across the sector, but it's scattered. One of our goals is to help bring that together in ways that are more accessible for both seed and market practitioners. And finally, I want us to highlight a few ways to stay connected from today that up-to-date opportunities. So please sign up for ISSD Africa newsletters and also Pro Wash and Scale newsletters. And I strongly encourage you to join Marketing Crisis Community of Practice if you already know, if you're there, good. And it's also a very active space for continuing this kind of conversation and digging deeper in more of experiences. To conclude, yes, this deck of the webinar will be circulated, and we'll find links, and you will also find links to the resources, including the already mentioned 10 guiding principles for good seed aid, other tools like context analysis, a tool for conflict, and also seed emergency response tool. Broader of this reference in the market-based programming paper itself. We are excited to keep working with you, and thank you. Hoping to get in touch next time. Thank you very much. Over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. I have very little left to say. You've said it all very nicely. Thanks to everybody in the audience for being here with us today. I think at one point we reached 185 people, so I'm very happy with that, and a good endorsement that the topic is relevant for a lot of people. Again, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for your time and your energy. Wishing everybody a good day. All the best. Bye bye for now.